The average Red Guard was 16 years old. Some were younger. They were high school students, teenagers who had grown up under Mao Zedong, who had been taught since birth that the chairman was the sun around which all Chinese life orbited, and who, in August 1966, were given permission to do something that no authority figure in their lives had ever permitted before. They were told to destroy. Destroy the old culture. Destroy the old customs. Destroy the teachers who had taught them. Destroy the intellectuals, the artists, the writers, the scientists, the anyone who represented the world that existed before the revolution. They did it. Between 1966 and 1976, the Cultural Revolution killed an estimated 1 to 2 million people. It persecuted 100 million more, 1/9 of China's entire population. It was not carried out by soldiers or secret police. It was carried out by children. Children that a man in his 70s had handed a weapon to and pointed at his enemies. And when it was over, when the destruction was complete, when the teachers were dead and the temples were rubble and the books were ash, Mao looked at what his Red Guards had done and sent them to the countryside to be re-educated. He had used them. And then he was finished with them. By 1966, Mao Zedong had a problem. The Great Leap Forward, this channel's episode 23, had killed an estimated 45 million people in 4 years. The catastrophe had forced Mao to step back from the day-to-day management of the Chinese state, allowing pragmatic leaders like Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping to implement policies that reversed some of the most damaging aspects of the Great Leap and stabilized the economy. The stabilization worked. Mao hated it. The policies that were saving China from the consequences of his decisions were, in his framework, evidence that the revolution was being betrayed, that revisionist elements within the Communist Party were steering China back toward capitalism and away from the pure communist vision he had spent his life pursuing. He was also, more simply, losing power. Liu Shaoqi had effectively replaced him as the functional head of state. Deng Xiaoping was managing the party apparatus. Mao retained his symbolic authority and his cult of personality, but the practical levers of governance were in other hands. His solution was to go outside the party. On May 16, 1966, Mao issued the circular that formally launched the Cultural Revolution, calling for the elimination of bourgeois elements within the party, the government, the army, and cultural institutions. He mobilized the youth. Students at universities and high schools across China were encouraged to form Red Guard units, paramilitary organizations that would serve as the vanguard of the Cultural Revolution, attacking the enemies of the revolution wherever they found them. On August 18, 1966, Mao appeared at Tiananmen Square before a crowd of approximately 1 million Red Guards. A student leader named Song Binbin climbed to the top of the gate and placed a Red Guard armband on Mao's arm. Mao asked her name. She said, Song Binbin, which means gentle and refined. Mao said, be more militant. The Red Guards went home and began. The first target of the Cultural Revolution was the four olds. Old ideas. Old culture. Old customs. Old habits. The Red Guards were tasked with destroying every trace of China's pre-revolutionary past, the religions, the temples, the traditional practices, the literature, the art, the historical artifacts that connected contemporary China to the civilization that had preceded the Communist Party. Temples were ransacked and destroyed. Statues were smashed. Books were burned. Street names were changed. People with traditional-sounding names were forced to change them. Shopkeepers with businesses that had operated for generations were forced to close. The destruction was comprehensive and rapid. China's cultural heritage, accumulated across millennia, was attacked by teenagers in weeks. What could be destroyed quickly was destroyed quickly. What took longer took longer. If this history is new to you, subscribe to Unsolved East and hit like. New episodes every week. The violence of the Cultural Revolution took several forms. The most systematic was the struggle session, denunciation meetings at which people accused of being class enemies, counter-revolutionaries, or revisionists were brought before crowds of Red Guards and forced to confess to crimes that were defined so broadly as to encompass almost any aspect of ordinary intellectual or professional life. Teachers were struggled against by their students. Professors were publicly humiliated by teenagers who could not have passed their courses. Artists were forced to destroy their own work. Scientists were made to renounce their research. Writers were compelled to denounce their writing. The physical violence at struggle sessions ranged from humiliation to beatings to death. Many victims were killed by crowds or died as a result of injuries sustained during sessions. Many more committed suicide rather than face continued persecution. The specific death toll attributable to struggle sessions is impossible to establish precisely. The violence was distributed across hundreds of thousands of sessions, conducted by local Red Guard units without centralized record keeping. The most extreme documented instance of Cultural Revolution violence occurred in Guangxi province. The Cultural Revolution was characterized by violence and chaos across Chinese society, with estimates of the death toll typically ranging from 1 to 2 million, including a massacre in Guangxi that included acts of cannibalism. Wikipedia. The Guangxi massacres of 1967 and 1968 produced documented evidence of mass killing, rival Red Guard factions, military units, and civilian mobs killing members of designated class enemy categories, that included specific documented cases of cannibalism. People identified as class enemies were killed and their flesh consumed in what investigators later characterized as ritualized political violence that had escalated beyond anything that could be explained by individual pathology. The Guangxi cannibalism cases were documented by Chinese investigators after the Cultural Revolution ended. Approximately 100,000 people died in Guangxi alone. The specific leaders who had incited and organized the violence in Guangxi received, in the limited accountability process that followed the Cultural Revolution, sentences that reflected the Chinese government's preference for moving past the period rather than reckoning fully with it. Most received relatively light punishments. Some were not prosecuted at all. By 1968, the Red Guards had served their purpose. The party establishment that Mao had wanted to destroy had been sufficiently purged. The violence was becoming ungovernable, Red Guard factions were fighting each other, entire provinces were in a state of near civil war, and the chaos that had been useful to Mao was becoming a threat to the state itself. Mao's solution was characteristically simple. He sent the Red Guards to the countryside. The Down to the Countryside movement, launched in 1968, transferred approximately 16 million young people from the cities to rural areas, where they would learn from the peasants and be re-educated through physical labor. The teenagers who had been given the power to destroy China were now being sent to farm fields. Many never returned to the cities. Many spent years or decades in rural areas, losing their educational opportunities, their professional prospects, and the urban lives they had expected to live. The generation that had been Mao's instrument of political violence became, in turn, victims of the same political system that had mobilized them. They are called the Lost Generation. Mao Zedong died on September 9, 1976. Within weeks, his widow Jiang Qing and three of her closest political allies, Zhang Chunqiao, Yao Wenyuan, and Wang Hongwen, collectively known as the Gang of Four, were arrested. They were accused of exploiting the Cultural Revolution for personal political gain and of being responsible for its worst excesses. The trial of the Gang of Four, conducted in 1980 and 1981, was one of the most significant political trials in Chinese history. Jiang Qing, who had been a central figure in the Cultural Revolution's cultural persecution, overseeing the suppression of art, literature, and performance that did not conform to revolutionary standards, was defiant in court. She argued that everything she had done was done in service of Mao's instructions. She was not wrong. Jiang Qing was convicted and sentenced to death. The sentence was subsequently commuted to life imprisonment. She died in prison in 1991. The trial of the Gang of Four addressed the Cultural Revolution's excesses while carefully preserving Mao's legacy. The official verdict on Mao, established in the Chinese Communist Party's 1981 resolution on certain questions in the history of our party, was the same formula this channel documented in the Great Leap Forward episode. 70% correct. 30% wrong. The Cultural Revolution was the 30%. The portrait remained on Tiananmen. Song Binbin, the student who had placed the armband on Mao's arm on August 18, 1966, to whom Mao had said be more militant, spent decades in the United States after emigrating. In 2014, she returned to her former high school in Beijing for a public ceremony. She apologized. She apologized to the teachers who had been persecuted at her school, the educators who had been struggled against, beaten, humiliated, and in some cases killed, and to their families. She was 67 years old. The teachers she was apologizing to were dead. Their families accepted the apology. Some said it was insufficient. Some said it was the most anyone from the Red Guard generation had ever offered. The people who were 16 years old in 1966 are in their 70s now. They are the lost generation, the approximately 16 million young people who were sent to the countryside between 1968 and the late 1970s, who lost their education, their professional opportunities, and in many cases their families during the years they spent in rural re-education. Some eventually returned to the cities. Some built lives in the countryside where they had been sent. Some left China entirely. What they carry, the specific knowledge of what they did as teenagers at the instruction of a state that subsequently sent them to farms when their usefulness was exhausted, is the kind of thing that does not resolve. It is carried. The Chinese government's official position on the Cultural Revolution is that it was a catastrophic mistake, a period of turmoil for which the Gang of Four bears primary responsibility, and for which Mao bears partial responsibility as the 30% of his legacy that was wrong. This position does not produce a full reckoning. It does not address the specific experiences of the 100 million people who were persecuted. It does not provide compensation to the families of those killed. It does not answer the question that the lost generation has spent 50 years living inside. What do you do with the knowledge of what you did at 16, at the instruction of someone you were taught to worship, to people who deserved none of it? Some have answered that question with public apology. Song Binbin in 2014. Others have not answered it publicly. The teachers who were beaten are gone. The temples that were destroyed cannot be fully restored. The books that were burned are ash. Mao's portrait is still on Tiananmen.